Move it, you black bitch. Who the hell do you think you are, standing in the way of the superior cavalry? Officer Tom Briggs roared like a power-drunk beast, then slammed his horse into a black woman in the middle of the crowded square like she was nothing but dirt. But what he didn't know, that woman was Angela Freeman, a federal judge, and when her badge hit the pavement, it echoed like a thunderclap across the face of the entire corrupt system. Prejudice just trampled the wrong woman, and now it's about to pay the price in blood and shame. What state are you in? If you saw this happen, would you turn away or scream in their face, "Enough, you monsters"? Downtown was drenched in bright sunlight. The rays reflected off the glass facades of tall buildings and spilled onto the wide streets where a crowd had gathered. Loudspeakers issued reminders to maintain order, blending with chants that rose and fell in rhythmic waves across intersections. Protest signs swayed in the wind, reflecting white light against dark clothing and sweat-streaked brows of the demonstrators. At the base of a traffic light pole, a young mother cradled a sleeping infant wrapped in cloth. Nearby, several students with backpacks bore hand-painted slogans demanding the right to live equally. They didn't shout or push, but their eyes burned with an unwavering determination. Among them stood laborers in dark blue uniforms, calloused hands and tired faces forming a wall of bodies shoulder to shoulder. Angela Freeman stepped in from the sidewalk, her low-heeled shoes softly pressing against the dry pavement. Her white blouse was buttoned to the collar, sleeves fitting snugly around her slender wrists. The dark business skirt shaped a tidy figure, modest and understated. She held a compact handbag close to her chest, eyes scanning the crowd calmly. No one could have guessed that within that composed presence coexisted both a sharp intellect and a deeply oppositional past. A few recognized her and nodded in greeting. A middle-aged woman brushed Angela's sleeve in passing and murmured, "You really came?" but didn't stop. Angela replied with a gentle, tilted smile and took a few more steps before halting by a tree near the second turn. She carried no slogan, wore no name tag. She was a quiet anomaly within a moving landscape. From her vantage point, Angela could see most of what was unfolding. Her breathing was steady, her shoulders relaxed. But deep in her memory, old dust began to stir. Her 20s when she was cornered against a wall just for wearing a hoodie late at night. A flashlight shone directly in her face. A hand shoved her shoulder without explanation, and the contemptuous stare of someone who claimed just a random check was not distant. She stood there for moments like those, for children who might grow up thinking that silence is the only way to live peacefully. Today wasn't a day to shout, but it was a day to show up. A murmur snapped her back. Down the street, a row of officers in dark uniforms scanned the crowd repeatedly. One enforcement officer raised a walkie-talkie to his mouth, whispered something, then nodded to a colleague. At the same moment, near the edge of the road, a young man stepped across the white line, lifting a sign that read, "My voice matters." A police officer raised his hand, lightly pushing the man's chest. No scuffle broke out, but tension spread palpably through the air. Angela watched the scene, hand tightening on her bag, eyes steady and cold. She didn't step forward, nor did she retreat. Unusual things often began with the smallest signs, and her instincts told her something was drawing near with each minute. Then came the sound of hooves echoing from the end of the street, steady and heavy like drum beats tightening the atmosphere. The crowd paused. Some turned around, their gazes shifting from curious to wary. Slogans were lowered slightly. Those at the front began to step back onto the sidewalk, creating space for the approaching mounted unit, and their shoulder armor gleamed under the sun. Helmets polished, reins held tightly. The large horses, deep black eyes, and twitching manes moved with calculated grace. The sound of hooves hitting pavement created a rhythm that commanded silence. The power lay not in speech but in presence, muscles trained to obey. Leading the formation was Tom Briggs. His body was broad, his posture erect like a steel rod in the saddle. His gaze swept the crowd as if hunting for a weakness to pierce. Lips drawn tight, His expression revealed nothing but guarded aggression. Among his peers, the name Briggs came with two things: no compromise and no questions. He had been flagged for excessive conduct in 3 prior cases, yet each file had been closed under internal resolution. No further inquiry followed. Subordinates described him as heavy-handed. Protesters had a simpler term: the one who strikes first. A young officer riding beside him glanced at the increasingly silent crowd and muttered, "They're all just standing still now." Briggs squinted at the hand-lettered signs. "Standing to provoke, same thing," he replied, voice low but heavy as falling stone. Briggs scanned each face. To him, this crowd had no names, no ages. They were a threat, a drop waiting to spill over. Every defiant stare, every furrowed brow smelled the same: challenge. Then he saw Angela. She stood still at the edge of the sidewalk, unmoving. Her stance was unlike those around her, neither afraid nor posturing for courage. She stood like someone who knew what was coming and chose to stay. Smaller than expected, her bearing nonetheless made him lean forward slightly in the saddle for a clearer look. Her eyes, sharp and steady, never shifted even as hooves reached the curb's edge. Briggs curled his lip, part scoff, part provocation. To him, a black woman standing still in front of mounted police was not normal. That old instinct in his mind warned that someone like her was either delusional or baiting a disruption. Both needed to be shut down before escalation. Behind them, the crowd surged again. Chants grew more synchronized, signs lifted high like fists gripping pent-up fury. "I can't breathe," "Reform the force," "End police terror." The voices had rhythm, and the people had reason. Briggs tightened his reins. His horse stepped forward, sensing its rider's shift. Briggs guided it down onto the street, then slowly moved toward Angela. No one shouted, no one stopped him. The distance was down to a few steps. Angela hadn't moved. Her hand rested on the strap of her bag, eyes fixed forward. The scene carved itself into the morning sky, where absurdities wore legal uniforms. Briggs stopped. Their eyes locked. On one side, authority forged from force. On the other hand, silence was weighted with unspoken truth. And somewhere in that moment, something shifted. No one noticed, but the ground beneath the hooves had just trembled. The mounted police unit began tightening its formation. The massive horses moved in close, each hoof striking the pavement with a thunderous rhythm that made bystanders want to cover their ears. Protesters gradually pulled back to the sides, yielding the central space to a force that demanded no justification. Slogans fell to the ground, and arms that had once been raised now hung beside bodies, palms sweating in silence. Angela remained in her place. She neither retreated nor advanced. The gap between her and Tom Briggs's horse was less than an arm's length. The horse's breath blew against her shirt sleeve, carrying a metallic and sweaty scent intensified by the harsh sunlight. She glanced upward and locked eyes with the officer holding the reins. In those eyes, there were no questions, only something that saw through her, as if she were a figure conjured solely as a warning. A sudden tug of the reins caused the horse to rear slightly. Its front legs stretched forward, one hoof scraping the pavement just inches from Angela's shoe. Cracks in the asphalt sent dust rising into the air, slicing through the space between their faces. Angela flinched backward, one arm rising instinctively to shield her face, and she shouted, "Get back!" Her voice wasn't loud, but clear enough for those nearby to turn and look. Her arm extended directly toward Tom, just under half a meter from the horse's head. In Tom's mind, the image became a trigger. A dark-skinned arm raised, lips tight, brow tense. He didn't see a woman under threat. He remembered a riot 3 years ago when a fellow officer had been shoved to the ground by a black man and broken his arm. That same arm motion, that same strained expression. Tom could never forget the scream of the older officer crumpled on the pavement, blood soaking through his armor. How? He projected that memory onto Angela. Even though her hands were empty, even though she hadn't moved forward or uttered a single threat, in his eyes, she was danger. Something that needed to be subdued for order's sake. The noise behind them grew louder. People in the crowd shouted, "Hey, watch it!" and "Get back!" A young man reached out to shield his girlfriend, pulling her toward a lamppost. All eyes turned toward Angela, the only one not retreating, not screaming. "Watch out, that woman," someone yelled from the right. The voice held no malice, just fear, but in that moment, it added weight to Tom's frayed tension. Briggs tightened the reins again. His hands clenched the leather straps, eyes fixed on Angela's raised arm as if it were the prelude to defiance. No one gave an order, no one urged him forward. But something unsaid pushed him to the brink. Angela stepped half a pace back. Her foot touched the edge of a pavement tile, and she stopped. Her arms stayed at chest level. Her chin lifted. She didn't shout again, didn't step away, didn't advance. It was like a wound revealed, yet the blade still hovered. The silence was so taut, it felt like the entire street held its breath. Briggs pressed his lips together. A flicker in his jaw caused his face to twitch slightly. In his mind, everything had been decided, and in that moment, the decider wasn't the crowd nor Angela. It was him, the one elevated above ground, with a horse beneath him, his bitterness beyond the control of a rational heartbeat. Tom leaned forward slightly, tapping his boot into the side of the gray horse. The nudge required little force, but was enough to launch the animal forward. Front legs stretched in intimidation. The crowd recoiled instantly. Shouts rang out. "Get back! Black bitch, who do you think you are, standing in the way of the elite cavalry?" The horse lunged, its head flinging upward. The strap of Angela's bag was grazed, her body thrown back, arms flailing reflexively, her knee slipping on the polished stone. She fell like a branch, snapped by the wind. Her left cheek hit the ground first, followed by her shoulder, then her palm bracing against the sun-scorched pavement. A dry clack echoed, the sound of metal falling from her chest, rolling toward the wheel of a nearby street vendor's cart. No one noticed it in the shock that had just unfolded. The crowd erupted. A woman in her 40s, still holding a bag of groceries, screamed, "She didn't do anything!" The cry shattered the suffocating silence that had persisted since the beginning. Another person clutched a friend's sleeve, pulling them to the curb. Phones emerged, camera lights igniting under the bright sun. A young man in a faded t-shirt, a sports watch on his left wrist, raised his phone. His head trembled slightly, but not his hand. The lens caught Angela being helped up by two older women. Her hand clutched her knee, hair disheveled, gaze not panicked but sharpened with intense focus. Another horse in the unit moved in, its rider gripping the reins firmly. A member of the crowd reached out to intervene, but was instantly struck aside by a baton. From across the street, a child's cry pierced the air, and someone herded the little ones into a cafe, frantically locking the door behind them. A photojournalist about 20 meters away adjusted his lens. He saw the impact, the horse's rearing head, the woman's collapse. His finger pressed the shutter repeatedly, without thought, driven purely by instinct. Frame after frame captured light, her falling form, dust swirling under hooves. He didn't know who she was, didn't understand what had just happened, but a headline repeated in his mind. Black woman, trampled by horse. Cause unknown. Angela slowly propped herself up on one elbow. Her face was dusted with dirt, her left cheek flushed red, a fine scrape trailing from her cheekbone to the corner of her mouth. She sat upright, eyes not searching for anyone, but focused on the object that had fallen. The metal judicial badge lay beside the cart's wheel, sunlight glinting off the engraved words. No one noticed it. No one was close enough to understand its significance. The two women held her arms. One asked gently, "Are you okay?" while the other signaled for medics from afar. Angela didn't answer. She breathed heavily, lips pressed tight, eyes locked on the item in the street as if afraid it would be trampled, erased. Tom turned his horse. No one ordered him to do so. But the crowd's eyes no longer looked away. He backed off one step, saying nothing. His eyes stayed on the woman rising slowly. There was no regret in his gaze, no fear, only a cold numbness, as if everything he had done still lay within the bounds of duty. Angela stood fully, her arms hanging by her sides, not resisting, but the chill in her eyes made several people behind Tom glance at each other. Something had been set in motion, and it wasn't in the bruises. It was in the unseen badge and in the footage being captured, second by second. Lloyd Peterson closed the van door and dropped heavily into the driver's seat, sweat streaking down his temple. His worn fabric cap lay on the dashboard in front of the equipment he had used for 8 years as a freelance photojournalist for major news agencies. The morning protest had seemed uneventful at first, until screams broke out in rapid succession, and an image from the mounted police unit prompted him to instinctively raise his camera and hold it steady for nearly 5 minutes. He removed the memory card and inserted it into his laptop on the passenger seat. Launching a basic editing program, he fast-forwarded the early footage to isolate the moment he needed to examine. A blur of motion, blinding light, a few batons swinging sideways, then a white figure collapsing. He replayed it multiple times, locking onto a frame that had nearly slipped past. The image froze on a stretched shirt, a slipping bag strap, and a small object flying from the subject's chest. The frame detonated in the turbulent air. His froze on a stretched shirt, a slipping bag strap, and a small object flying from the subject's chest. He zoomed in frame by frame. A metallic item spun mid-air, distorted by the reflected sunlight. It hit the pavement, bounced once, and rolled toward the corner of the frame. Lloyd squinted, adjusted the contrast, muted the background noise, and increased the exposure. A badge slowly came into view. He isolated the frame and zoomed in until each pixel was visible. The text emerged, blurred but legible. Federal Judge, USS Circuit Court of Appeals. Lloyd sat upright. His hands dropped from the keyboard, pressing against the laptop's edge. Silence filled his mind. He was no stranger to that title. He had taken portraits of judges at conferences and filmed major hearings in Washington. That rank was unmistakable. The badge was not issued to clerks or aides. It was reserved solely for officially appointed federal judges. A chilling realization struck him. A mounted police officer had just attacked a federal judge in broad daylight, in the middle of the street, before hundreds of witnesses and cameras, and she had never identified herself. Lloyd rewound the footage. It was indeed the face he had seen in a magazine last year, in an article about a woman from Atlanta, appointed as a district chief judge. Name, Angela Freeman. The article had described her as expected to bring reform to civil rights cases. He still remembered the photo. Her standing on the steps of the Sixth Circuit Federal Court, eyes fixed on the lens, a restrained smile. Now, those same eyes were seen in a video where she fell to the ground under the force of a charging horse. He put on his headphones, replaying the final 4 seconds of the clip repeatedly. There was no scream from her, no sign of resistance, just a reflex, a fall, and the badge dropping. Lloyd opened his internal email system, typed the subject line, "Urgent, ID this woman, Angela Freeman," and attached a screenshot of the badge, her scratched face, and the clipped video. In the message body, he wrote briefly, "Urgent. I believe this is federal judge Angela Freeman, just thrown down by mounted police at the center of this morning's protest. Clip attached. Immediate verification needed." After hitting send, Lloyd leaned back in his seat, gripping the strap of the camera still hanging at his side. Outside the van window, sirens echoed, and the crowd had thinned. He knew this story had moved far beyond a clash between police and protesters. It was now a deep incision into the image of an entire system, and he held the first piece of proof. 2 hands gently pulled Angela's arms from either side, a woman's voice on the left, trembling with emotion. "Are you okay? Why, can you stand up?" Angela shifted her weight, pressed her foot against the ground to regain balance. Her right knee throbbed, but she didn't flinch. The arm, yanked during the fall, hadn't fully recovered. Her shoulder ached like tiny needles pricking each nerve. Her left cheek burned, partly from dirt, partly from the swelling skin. She stood up with a slight hunch, eyes scanning the murmuring crowd. Her breath was uneven, but her feet began to move. One of the helpers asked, "Do you need an ambulance?" Angela shook her head. Her voice wasn't steady enough to respond, but her eyes said enough to silence the offer. Beneath a delivery truck just a few steps away, a metallic object reflected a faint glint. It lay still, mostly hidden by a plastic container. Angela didn't turn back. In that fleeting moment when her eyes last met it, she chose to do nothing. She didn't bend down, didn't call attention, didn't let anyone see. A badge like that could ignite a crowd simmering with fury, and if the officers in blue discovered the truth under these circumstances, the consequences would be beyond her control. The first thought that flashed through her mind was of a trial 3 years ago, when a Hispanic girl was wrongly arrested for touching an officer who had been slapping her drunken father. Upon reviewing the entire case file, Angela discovered the original video had been trimmed by 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds the officer had raised his hand first. The truth had been distorted, and the one who resisted became the one blamed. Cases like that she had presided over, heard victims speak with choking voices, seen witnesses retract statements after a single glare from across the courtroom. It all returned, unbidden, but deeply familiar. She began walking. One step at a time, passers-by pressed against the curb, past bewildered and suspicious stares. Her dark shoes were dusted, her bag strap hung low at her hip, and her shirt was skewed toward her injured shoulder. But her posture remained upright. Her shoulders did not slump like someone defeated. As she passed a group of officers guarding the intersection, some glanced her way. No one spoke. To them, she was just another protester who had been dispersed by protocol. At the end of the sidewalk, a young man held a phone, his gaze focused in the opposite direction. When Angela approached, he froze, eyes widening as if someone had pressed a long-forgotten memory. That face, he had seen it before, not online, not in the news, but in a solemn courtroom, where sunlight streamed through the windows onto a judge's robe. He had heard her speak during an appeals hearing on the deportation of refugees in Louisiana. That figure, the way she placed her hand on the bench, her cold gaze and clear words. "That's Judge Freeman," he muttered, then quickly looked around. His friend beside him frowned. "Who? The lady who got thrown off the horse?" He didn't answer, just watched Angela disappear into a side alley, walking faster. Angela caught his gaze for a split second. She didn't smile or flinch. She simply tightened her grip on the bag strap, turned her face away, and moved out of sight. The wind swept her hair back. Amidst the suffocating city, a silent wave had begun to rise from where no one had been looking, and the name Angela Freeman was now surfacing, not just in court records. The video lasted less than 15 seconds, beginning with a forceful push from a gray horse and ending with a black woman collapsing onto the pavement, her cheek scraping the asphalt. In the final few frames before the cut, sunlight glinted off a metallic object rolling into a shadowed corner. Someone paused the clip, zoomed in, and typed 2 capitalized words in the caption, "Badge." The video was first posted by the account @JusticeFeed, a channel dedicated to monitoring human rights violations and civil unrest. Its stark, almost bare-bones description read, "She didn't fight, she didn't speak, yet she was thrown to the ground. That woman is a federal judge." There was no background music, no effects. The rawness of it alone made viewers stop and share. Within 3 hours, the video had been shared more than 30,000 times. Edits quickly appeared on TikTok, some with voiceovers quoting the judicial oath of office. Another account juxtaposed a photo of Angela in her black robe at court last year, with the clip showing dried blood and dust on the collar of her white shirt. A still frame of the badge rolling from her pocket was overlaid with bold text, "Federal Judge, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals." The focus was no longer on the fall. The story was now ricocheting toward the institutions once believed untouchable. And now, a figure from within that very system had fallen beneath a horse's hooves. The hashtag Angela Freeman spread like dry wildfire. It was followed by mounted violence, police brutality, and "She is the law." Lawyers, journalists, and professors from Harvard, Howard, and Berkeley spoke up. One professor wrote, "I once sat beside her at a criminal justice reform conference. Now I'm watching her trampled like an unnamed criminal." Midday News cautiously reported the incident, but the internet had already surged ahead. Old photos of Angela were reposted, her swearing-in ceremony, her presence at civil rights conferences, even her student scholarship profile. Beneath each post, the same question echoed: if a judge is treated this way, What hope is there for ordinary people? On forums for Black communities, users began recounting similar incidents. A woman from Texas recalled how her sister was knocked down by a mounted police officer during a 2021 protest, and they had never found footage to prove it. A man from Atlanta posted a photo of his son's bloodied shoes from another horse-led protest dispersal. An interactive map was released by the group People's Watchdog, displaying over 60 similar incidents across 5 years, from California to Minnesota in both small towns and major cities. The red dots covered the map densely, as if people were only now opening their eyes to something long folded away. That evening, a group of former federal court employees confirmed via email to the Constitutional Review magazine, "The woman in the clip is Judge Angela Freeman. We assert this without doubt." At the same time, a prominent human rights activist wrote online, "We've seen victims with broken arms, crushed necks, tasered bodies, but never has someone of her rank been treated this way in broad daylight. This won't remain a minor case. This is the final drop." And indeed, it didn't just spill over, it began to collapse everything. The captain's office wasn't large, but always silent. Tom Briggs entered with a decisive stride, showing no signs of fatigue or confusion. Dust from the morning still clung to his sleeves, and his helmet sat beside the captain's half-finished coffee. The air was heavy with leftover cigarette smoke, despite the cracked open window. The captain didn't look up immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, where a looping video showed the black woman being thrown beneath the horse. The glow of the monitor highlighted the lines on his nose, deeper than usual. "You know what's happening out there, don't you?" he asked quietly, still not turning around. Tom clasped his hands behind his back, voice steady. "I've heard a bit, but there's been no internal report." The captain shut off the monitor and swiveled in his chair. "Things are heating up. The media spread too fast. Your name is already showing up on forums. I think you should lie low for a few days. Let's call it tactical leave." Tom raised an eyebrow, not quite believing what he heard. "I thought this morning was just handling a stubborn woman. No one got seriously hurt, just crowd control." The captain leaned back, looking him straight in the eye. "That's exactly why you should take leave. Let me and legal handle the rest." Then, as if that weren't enough, he added, "And if the victim's identity is what people say it is, you'd better start praying." Tom lowered his head, his voice now tinged with irritation. "What identity?" "There are rumors that a woman's a federal judge," the captain replied. Tom gave a short, sharp laugh, like scoffing at a joke. "A woman in a white blouse yelling in the street is a judge? That's exactly why you need to step back," the captain shot back, then pulled a file from a drawer. "Last question. Is there anything you need to add to this morning's incident report?" Tom responded like a machine. "Tense situation. Subject obstructed the line formation. Fell due to imbalance. I'll submit a full report by the end of the day." Across the hall, the internal communications room was running multiple video cuts to prepare a crisis response plan. The PR advisory team had been in session since early morning, all agreeing on one principle: control the image before someone else controls it for us. A red-haired strategist issued a warning. If that badge frame is real, and if the victim is who they say she is, Briggs won't just be on leave. Meanwhile, at a small cafe in Brooklyn, a WNYC journalist reopened the police department's internal complaint files. She underlined 3 names that had previously filed abuse reports against Tom. All 3 had ended with the phrase, "resolved internally, no disciplinary action." She shook her head and began contacting those involved for interviews. A well-known human rights blogger also shared a photo of Tom from a protest last year. He stood in front, baton held at his waist, face cold as stone. The caption read simply, "He's always at the front, and this time he trampled an entire system." When Tom left the captain's office, the late afternoon sun was already slanting down the corridor. Light through the glass cast a long shadow of his figure across the tiled floor. The captain watched him go, eyes no longer scolding, but calculating the depth of the wave that had just begun to swell. He exhaled, muttering to himself, "If she really is someone important, then all of us are standing in front of something bigger than media." The evening news on WNYC began with a steady, cold-toned voice as if the anchor had weighed every word before airing. On the screen, a bold headline scrolled beneath the video, "Identity Confirmed. The woman assaulted by mounted police is federal judge Angela Freeman." The footage shown was a frame from the viral video, capturing the exact moment her badge flew from her chest, the slanted light reflecting the embossed text on the pavement. Next appeared her official portrait, Angela in a black robe, shoulders slightly turned, eyes calm and steady as they faced the camera, a face once featured in her federal appointment file from 2 years ago. The anchor continued in a low voice. "Three sources have confirmed: the clerk's office of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, the public records of the Department of Justice, and an unofficial statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The woman in the video is Angela Freeman, currently being treated at Santa Laura Hospital for soft tissue injuries and a bruised knee." The information spread within less than 2 minutes. Social media platforms responded like digital seismic maps tracing a fresh epicenter. In legal forums, the announcement was pinned to the top. Underneath, scholars began systemic analyses that went far beyond a single fall. A law professor from Columbia University wrote, "This sets a dangerous precedent. Unprovoked violence against a sitting judge reflects the judiciary's deteriorating authority in the eyes of law enforcement." On air, a former federal judge was invited to speak during the late-night discussion panel. He shook his head, gripping a glass of water, and said, "I never thought I'd say this on television. A fellow judge fallen under horse hooves in the middle of the street in broad daylight. And why? For joining a peaceful protest. If even that isn't respected, then what meaning remains in the courts we once presided over?" The pressure extended beyond the legal realm. A state legislator issued an emergency statement demanding the immediate suspension of all officers present at the scene and the release of the full list of mounted unit members involved. From the Sixth Circuit Judges Association, a concise declaration was published within less than 2 hours of the broadcast. "We demand an independent, transparent, and comprehensive investigation. Violence against a judge, or any citizen, is a serious violation of the principle of equality before the law." That same night, the front page of the Washington Sentinel previewed a draft for an in-depth exposé. Angela Freeman, an outspoken critic of using horses in crowd control. The article included an image of a research paper she had presented at the Public Justice Conference last year, in which she clearly warned, "When symbols of authority are placed atop beasts, the people no longer see justice, they see fear." In newsrooms, reporters rushed to produce fresh stories. One producer from Channel 18 said curtly to their editor, "We're not following the story anymore. We're standing in the middle of it." A special report was nearing completion, its title chosen with careful precision, each word heavy with weight. "The Judge Trampled," and "What It Teaches the System." Just as the news broadcast ended, Tom's hand slammed hard against the metal table, producing a sound that startled several nearby officers. He shot to his feet, voice breaking through clenched teeth, eyes red as if he'd swallowed fire. "No way. Judge my ass." The TV screen in the break room remained frozen on the frame of the judge in her black robe. The caption below scrolled slowly, each word deliberate, almost mocking. "Angela Freeman, federal judge, Sixth Circuit." Some officers glanced over, some hesitated, others pretended to check their phones, avoiding Tom's blazing gaze. He muttered to himself, "The media's pulling strings, all staged. I saw her clearly back then, waving, shouting, and pointing straight at me. That's not how a judge acts." A brief silence swallowed the room. No one replied. Tom pulled out his phone, replaying the video he had quickly recorded that day. The frame was shaky, off-center, showing only hooves pounding the pavement, chaotic shouting, a figure falling, then a sudden cut. The victim's face was not visible. The light was too harsh. A cold sensation crept along his wrist. He turned off the video, took a deep breath, and sat back down. The table still bore a red imprint of his hand. Later that evening, in the parking lot behind headquarters, Rivera approached, moving slowly as always. The sergeant had worked multiple deployments with Tom, a man of few words but deep understanding. Standing beside his vehicle without looking directly at him, he said, "I used to think it ended with just a fall." Tom turned, still burning with anger. "And now you believe them too? She was just another protester, pretending." Rivera exhaled quietly, his eyes fixed on the far brick wall. "Belief isn't the point anymore. The problem is the videos is everywhere. The office is reviewing every body cam clip. And if what that broadcast said is true, you better worry about the evidence you still control." Tom said nothing. He understood what Rivera meant, but his instincts rebelled against the feeling of being cornered. The arrogance that once kept him steady atop a horse amid countless protests was now starting to falter. That night, the first email from the Internal Conduct Oversight Unit was sent, summoning all officers present at the scene for statement verification. A young officer with a fresh face whispered in the break room, "If he deleted his body cam footage, he's done." Tom got home late. The small apartment on the 7th floor was no longer as quiet as usual. He unlocked his phone, scrolling through endless headlines. Angela Freeman's face appeared everywhere, on the news, on social media, in short clips from surveillance cameras. One image stopped him cold. Her face, those steady eyes, the scratch across her left cheek, was unmistakably the same person he had looked down on from above that morning. No shouting, no waving, just standing there, watching. Rivera's voice echoed again in his mind, this time lower, more resolute. "This isn't about who's right anymore. It's about who sinks first." Tom stood still for a long time. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor. He didn't bother picking it up. In the room, only the TV speaker remained, replaying the Judges Association's press conference. The first held in over 10 years, and they were meeting because of someone who had just fallen beneath his horse. Under the pale yellow light of the internal meeting room on the 3rd floor, the atmosphere was taut, as if on the brink of explosion. 4 people sat around a dark wooden table, each face marked by a different form of tension. Captain Lyle, with silver hair cropped around the ears, crossed his arms and glanced at Tom Briggs before shifting his gaze to Walker. He said little, just one sentence. "I don't need you to sugarcoat anything, but I do need a report that reassures the public. Concise, clean, and doesn't stir up more waves." Tom nodded slowly. He wore a faded blue shirt, holding a cup of coffee but not drinking it. His mind still swirled with fragmented images. The face of the woman pinned to the ground, the screams of protest, the glint of a badge he hadn't recognized in time. Instead of confronting his doubts, he retreated into a warped sense of confidence. "Everything needs to be cleaned up," he murmured, as if to remind himself. Walker sat back in the corner of the table. He remained silent, offered no opinions, but once the captain had finished, he stood, took a small hard drive from his pocket and indicated that he would review the necessary footage. No one stopped him, and no one mentioned the phrase, "delete data." In the profession, some things need not be spoken aloud. Server room 3 was unusually quiet. Walker unlocked the door, entered, then locked it behind him. The white walls reflected the glow of the server booting up, rows of LED lights flickering like eyes watching. He plugged the drive into the data port, entered a 2-step security code, and navigated quickly to the folder labeled bodycam_operations. The file appeared, 22 minutes of footage, complete with sound and video from his chest-mount camera. He scrubbed through the collision sequence, his eyes pausing when Angela Freeman appeared on the pavement. He clenched the strap on his shoulder and opened the editing tab. Instead of trimming the clip, he dragged the entire file into a permanent delete command from the temporary server. He extracted only the first 7 minutes, a routine patrol, and renamed the new folder Training_Tech 2025. When deletion was complete, the server emitted a soft ping, like a muted sigh. A hash code briefly flickered across the screen, a matching signature from the original file, even though it had just been erased. Walker didn't notice. He removed the drive, wiped the connector with his sleeve, and tucked it back into his pocket. Before leaving the room, he adjusted his collar, scanned the space, then turned off the lights and locked the door. His footsteps echoed lightly in the corridor, but his mind remained stuck on the image of Angela thrown back on impact. Something didn't feel right, but he forced himself to believe the opposite. I'm saving them from a media circus. He had seen colleagues lose their jobs over a single misframed shot, had heard TV lawyers twist lawful action into senseless brutality. This time, he chose the side of organizational stability, and for that, he added a smile to celebrate their loss. Yet, within that cold room, just a few meters above his head, a surveillance camera blinked steadily. The narrow lens still captured his hand movements, the flash of the deleted hash code, the subtle hesitation at the corner of his mouth. And that hash log, though buried among thousands of other files, still existed, forgotten but not erased. Walker exited the building, the wind catching the corner of his shirt. He didn't look back, but behind him, a twist had begun its countdown. The server room was located on sub-level 2 of the police department, a place few visited during the night shift except for a handful of technicians with special access. In that cold, windless space, Marcus Dinn sat before 3 monitors, his fingers gliding over the keyboard, the screen's glow reflecting off his rimless glasses, giving him the look of a flight engineer managing a spacecraft. He was the only Asian member of the IT team, soft-spoken, known for being meticulous, often staying later than scheduled just to triple-check things. It was pseudo-triple-check things. That night, Marcus was assigned to review the automatic backup logs of body cam devices and routine security error reports. He scanned through the data stream as usual until he paused at an unusual access log. A large file, labeled internal training, had been deleted and overwritten just hours after the protest incident. The access was under the name Walker, a familiar name often seen in sync reports, but this time, something didn't add up. Specifically, the security stream code, which should have followed the preserve full original protocol, had been temporarily bypassed. Marcus sat upright, something he only did when truly suspicious. He didn't call anyone. He didn't file an urgent report. Instead, he opened the hidden buffer archive, a system folder where ghost data fragments sometimes lingered. Within minutes, he extracted the original file, nearly intact due to delayed cache cleanup. As he backed it up to a private drive, he also logged the full activity history under Walker's credentials. Then he opened an encryption window and typed quickly, a Freeman Circuit 6, a code he had saved after a guest lecture by Angela Freeman at his former university. That day, she had worn a dark blue coat and spoken clearly about those who stay silent while justice is crushed. Though seated in the back row, Marcus remembered every word, and now, faced with data erased as if it had never existed, he couldn't remain still. He was no hero, but he understood the weight of holding the only surviving copy, something someone else was trying to destroy. He stored the drive safely in a personal lockbox and returned to his work as usual. He didn't report it to the system oversight, didn't flag it in the weekly logs, but he began inserting a hidden script. If anyone else accessed the bodycam folder, the system would send a silent alert to his phone. As the night passed its midpoint, a message appeared in his inbox, not through the internal network, but from a media address. The subject line was simple. Was the data manipulated, Marcus? He stared at the words. He didn't respond, but in the reflection of the screen, caution was giving way to something else, a sense of timing. And perhaps, for the first time in his career, Marcus realized, sometimes, silence saves no one. The upper-floor hospital room at Sinaloa was wrapped in a soft glow, the curtains half drawn, a thin breeze pushing the scent of disinfectant through the air. Angela Freeman lay there, her head propped up, heart rate monitor emitting steady pulses on the screen, her face pale from painkillers. A dark bruise spread from her left cheekbone down beneath the jawline, covering her jaw with a deepened purplish hue. Her right knee was lightly braced, with visible redness pressing through the fabric. The door opened gently as a young nurse entered, checking the monitor before tilting her head slightly. "She's waking up," the nurse said clearly, not loudly, as if signaling to the stillness in the room. Angela opened her eyes, her gaze first landing on the ceiling fan turning slowly above, then shifting toward the IV drip. Her eyelids fluttered, the muscles beneath twitching in a reflexive gesture of someone regaining consciousness after a traumatic spell. She inhaled slowly, her hand resting loosely on the edge of the blanket, feeling the slow rhythm of her own breath, settling. A staff member in a dark suit stepped inside. No introduction was needed. Their eyes exchanged recognition. Meredith Cole, Angela's private attorney, sat upright and pulled a thin folder from her briefcase. No preamble, no pleasantries. You still have time to decline if you wish, but I brought the request to initiate a federal investigation under Clause 32CC. Everything is prepared. It only needs your signature. Angela didn't respond. She looked at the file cover, then reached for the pen. Her right hand trembled slightly, but her handwriting held firm. Her fingertip paused at the line above her name, her gaze steady on the bold title, Use of Excessive Force in Civil Protest Context. No public statement, she said quietly. Sign it, but hold it. We speak when the time is right. Meredith nodded and collected the documents. No encouragement, no parting phrases. They had worked together for nearly a decade, understanding that victory didn't come from premature applause, but from striking precisely when it mattered most. Angela leaned back, staring at the ceiling, her eyes not fully closed. Her mind wasn't focused on Tom Briggs' face or the sound of a horse screaming in the street. It was on the cases she had tried, the weak testimony of threatened witnesses, the times she had read verdicts to people who believed justice was a luxury reserved for the powerful. She knew well that speaking now would turn the spotlight onto her reputation, her injuries, and the fact that even a judge could be brought down. But what Angela sought had never been self-preservation. She aimed for the structure of power that allowed it to happen, and only by exposing that would the story be worth telling. The lawyer laughed. Their final exchange of looks needed no words. Angela gripped the edge of the bedsheet, not from pain, but to anchor the memory of this moment. A new battle was taking form. Not in a courtroom, but in the public sphere, and perhaps even in places where justice was thought to be asleep. The night shift passed in the muted quiet of St. Alora's upper floor. The hallway lights cast long, murky beams through the glass, stretching silhouettes across the floor like drawn blades. Nadine Brooks, the overnight nurse, stepped into Angela's room with a wound care kit. Her face was youthful, but her eyes spoke of experience. An African-American woman in her 30s. The shoulder of her uniform still bearing creases from a shift that had lasted over a dozen hours. She lowered herself beside the bed, unwrapping the bandage on Angela's knee, her movements gentle and precise, as if tending to something fragile. They both remained silent. The only sounds were the soft peel of medical tape and the whisper of wind at the barely opened window. Nadine didn't look directly at Angela, her eyes often drifting downward, as if tidying up a silent truth. "You don't need to respond," she said, breaking the stillness, "but I'd like to tell you something, if that's okay." Angela didn't speak, simply turned her head to the side, her gaze soft but unyielding, a silent permission, neither pushing nor denying. Nadine continued, her voice calm and deliberate. "About a year ago, I was on the ER night shift. A young man came in. He'd been pushed down the hospital steps by police during a mental health episode. He was black, unarmed, just shouting. I saw an officer grab him by the shirt, slam his head into the wall right in front of me." Her hands paused slightly, then resumed bandaging. "I filed an internal report. 3 days in a row I was called to the administration. One evening, a man in plain clothes stood beside my car after my shift. Said nothing, just stood there. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to withdraw it." Angela didn't blink, but her gaze deepened, drilling into familiar shadows. Her hand tightened on the blanket, reacting to an emotional pressure, buried but present. Her eyes held not just anger, but recognition. She had seen this pain before, and now it stood in front of her, made real through a regular person, a nameless witness. Nadine spoke again, this time with firmer resolve. "When I saw you fall, I thought you'd get up and shout back, but you didn't. You stood. stayed silent. That's when I realized you were holding on to something bigger, and I believe you won't stay silent forever." Angela nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on Nadine. It was a wordless thank you, a punctuation mark in an unwritten paragraph. In that cold, white room, two women from different layers of power shared a breath of trust. Before leaving, Nadine quietly slid a small piece of paper under the glass beside Angela's water. She didn't say another word. On it was an email address, neatly written, with a short note. "If you need someone who's seen too much, I'm ready." Angela looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up, nor did she hide it. Her gaze turned toward the window, where the hallway's dim glow still stretched long. The silence in the room was no longer helplessness, but the pressure of a wave gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to rise. Under the early morning sunlight that had yet to fully warm, Tom Briggs heard the doorbell ring with the weight of a warning. Upon opening the door, he was met by two men in plain clothes, one of whom presented a badge and said in a calm, courteous voice, "We're from the federal prosecutor's office. This is a subpoena requesting your appearance for an internal hearing regarding the incident on the 18th. In his hand was a thin envelope stamped in bright red, containing words capable of altering anyone's life path. Tom's wife stepped out from inside the house, her expression alarmed. "What is this about? Did someone get hurt?" Tom shook his head, his lips pressed tightly, as if trying to maintain control, then spoke softly, as if to soothe her. "It's just a formality. They're blowing it out of proportion. I'll explain everything." But even he no longer believed that to be true. His first meeting with the appointed attorney took place in a small room inside the police station. The lawyer, young but seasoned, remained mostly silent. Tom recounted the incident with the familiar tone of defensive rationalization. "I acted according to protocol. The goal was crowd control, preventing escalation. The woman, raised her hand near the horse's face, clearly a threatening gesture. Tom stared into the lawyer's eyes, emphasizing each word as though trying to convince himself. He had always believed he was trained to handle high-risk situations, regardless of who the subject was. The only thing that mattered was their reaction. When he entered the interrogation room with the federal investigator, the atmosphere had completely changed. Gone were the exploratory questions and casual notes. Now there was deliberate silence. An older investigator flipped through a file on the table and asked simply, "Did you know who she was?" Tom raised his head and answered directly, "No, and even if I had known, I would have acted the same if necessary." The investigator said nothing more, only glanced at a comparison chart between Tom's current testimony and the initial report he had filed 3 days earlier. Several inconsistencies stood out. In one part, he claimed not to remember clearly due to distraction, while in another he asserted everything was under control. "So, did you record anything during the incident?" Tom froze. In a split second, the thought crossed his mind. The blurry short video he had filmed on his personal phone was never submitted, but they had asked. They knew. "We'll need all personal recording devices from that time, including your phone," the investigator continued, his voice even, as if reading from a notice. Tom glanced down at his hands resting on his thighs, fingers tapping lightly against the seam of his pants. In that moment, he realized he no longer controlled the course of the case. He nodded, avoiding eye contact. On the way home, Tom felt cold, though the wind was still. He pulled out his phone, opened the locked album containing the original short video. The dark screen reflected his face, not the one confidently seated atop a horse, but a face starting to show cracks. Meredith Cole sat before a desk cluttered with files, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen displaying copies of the civil complaints. She had assigned a dedicated legal support team consisting of 2 young lawyers and an intern to review Tom Briggs's employment history, including citizen complaints and internal department records. Within just the first 24 hours, the team uncovered 3 notable lawsuits involving Tom. The first occurred 6 years ago, when a homeless man was pushed down the stairs at the East Side station. The record noted, "Handled internally, no press coverage." The second involved a university student participating in a peaceful protest who was struck with a baton while backing away. resulting in a broken right hand. The department later paid $12,000 in compensation in exchange for a dropped lawsuit and a non-disclosure agreement. The third, perhaps most concerning, alleged that a driver was choked after being stopped for obstructing traffic, but due to a lack of video evidence, the case was closed and filed as secondary. Meredith felt a chill after reading all three. She repeated to the team, "This isn't a series of isolated errors. This is a recurring behavioral pattern, and this time the consequence is a federal judge being trampled in public." That very morning, she submitted requests to reopen the two old cases, the student and the homeless man, citing increasing severity and systemic impact. She invoked Clause 214 on reinvestigation in cases with signs of internal shielding. Simultaneously, she proactively contacted the two attorneys who had previously represented the victims in those cases. One replied in under 2 hours, attaching an old letter addressed to the Internal Affairs Chief titled, "Tom Briggs, Trojan Horse in the Force." In the letter, the attorney wrote, "He doesn't need rage to inflict harm. He only needs a baton and silence from the system." Those words left Merritt in long silence. She knew that in an assault against the dignity of the judiciary, people would focus on the personal insult. But she wanted to shed light on the broader structure behind it, the system that had ignored multiple warnings, where repeated misconduct was not punished but filed away as internally resolved. She began reaching out to a journalist who had been covering the mounted unit for nearly a decade and had a private dossier on excessive behavior during protest enforcement. Over the phone, he confirmed Briggs was part of the frontline officers, always sent to the front, always favored when his reports didn't match reality. Meredith placed her hand on the printout of the email, reading, "We believe that if he wasn't stopped the first time, those who shielded him bear responsibility too." It was a wake-up call. Tom Briggs no longer stood alone in this case. She began mapping out the internal network of the force. Every link, every commanding officer, every person who signed internal memos without calling for an external investigation. The strategy shifted. The goal was no longer just to prove the misconduct of a single officer, but to expose the entire ecosystem that had allowed him to exist unchallenged until now. Under the flickering light of the evening news broadcast, the face of Lieutenant Gerald Mason appeared clearly in a special report. The anchor spoke with firm intonation. "The veteran officer in charge of Ohio's Mounted Police Unit, Lieutenant Mason, is now facing allegations of covering up misconduct within his division." Behind the reporter were images of leaked internal emails, some marked resolved, and signed electronically by Mason himself. Among the published documents, at least 5 reports related to Officer Tom Briggs had been sent to Mason's office, including official memos describing excessive force and abuse of power during last year's protests. Each page was displayed slowly on screen as the journalist highlighted the details. One report included a handwritten note in red ink reading, "Spoke with him privately, nothing serious." The female anchor added, "This comment appears at least 3 times on complaints involving Briggs. There were no records forwarded to the inspector and no formal disciplinary action was taken." Meanwhile, an investigative reporter from the Capitol Ledger stated that he had requested an interview with Mason weeks earlier but was declined. The reply letter from Mason's office contained only one sentence, "I ensure my officers carry out their duties appropriately, and no misconduct has occurred under my command intentionally." Beyond the media, reactions from legal circles shifted from shock to outrage. A former federal judge commented on CNN, "If Briggs was executing the order, then whoever kept him on the front line must share the responsibility. What we're witnessing is a breakdown in internal oversight." The Ohio Independent Oversight Association issued a statement the same day calling for Mason's suspension pending investigation. Some legal advocacy groups even pushed for a public hearing into the entire operation of the mounted unit over the past decade. Cracks began to show inside the police department. Anonymous officers leaked copies of overlooked reports. Strikingly, the handwriting on the forms was consistent. Numbers were crossed out, descriptions shortened, and a repeated phrase appeared like a script. The incident does not reflect a systemic issue. On an online forum for retired officers, one former cop posted bluntly, "Mason always said the same thing whenever someone crossed the line," like he was reading from a manual. Soon after, a civil rights organization called Torchlight Justice launched a campaign titled Hoofprint on Honor, demanding criminal accountability not only for those who committed the assault, but for the entire chain of leadership that allowed it to happen. At a brief press conference, the group's spokesperson declared, "If a system protects wrongdoing, that system is complicit, and you can't reform what you refuse to acknowledge." The story of Angela Freeman began to spread in an unforeseen direction. It was no longer just about an individual case. It began to expose a network of enablers who had allowed wrongdoing to persist for years. Within the shadows of a seemingly untouchable structure, the red ink handwriting was fast becoming the most damning proof of complicity. In the dimly lit garage of the police department, where dull fluorescent lights reflected off the patrol car shells, young Officer Ethan Morales stood in silence. Behind him, the steady sound of hooves echoed from the stables, a reminder of the incident from days earlier. He could still vividly recall the moment Tom Briggs yanked the reins, causing the horse to rear, its hoof grazing the shoulder of the woman as she fell. Ethan hadn't intervened directly, but he had been less than 2 meters away. He had seen everything, and since then the image hadn't once left his mind. That morning, a subpoena to testify as a witness had been placed in his locker, the ink stamp still fresh. An investigator from the independent office required his appearance within 3 days. Ethan hadn't told anyone, but the news seemed to have leaked. During shift change, a senior sergeant approached him, smirking, and said, "Those who know how to keep quiet last longer in this line of work." The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make the other rookies avert their eyes. Ethan didn't respond. He bowed his head, zipped up his jacket, his eyes dimming. On the drive home, he sat behind the wheel as though stuck between opposing lanes of traffic. At his small third-floor apartment, Ethan pulled out his personal phone and replayed the short video he had recorded during the protest. In the clip, a brief moment captured Tom grimacing, his hand tightening on the reins, then turning to look down before spurring the horse forward. The audio was unclear, but the crowd's reaction was visible. Angela Freeman was standing still, holding a face mask, her eyes wide in surprise. Ethan turned off the phone, wondering whether he could live in peace while hiding the clip. The answer wasn't clear. That night, he called his father, Mr. Morales, a seasoned former investigator who had retired early after a controversial riot control deployment 4 years ago. His father answered in silence, then said just one sentence, "If you can't look in the mirror after the trial, then that oath you took means nothing." Ethan said nothing. The words felt like a blade opening the final crack in his loyalty to the department. 3 days later, Ethan walked into the interview room of the Independent Investigations Office. The room was small, sterile white, with only a table, 2 chairs, and a recorder placed in the center. The investigator opened a folder and nodded slightly. "Mr. Morales, thank you for coming." A long pause followed before Ethan took a seat. He looked straight ahead, avoiding nothing. "I'll tell everything," he said, his voice clear but calm, "and I have a copy of the video if you need it." There was no applause at that moment, no cameras rolling, but something significant had shifted, not within the system, but within the courage of someone standing on the border between silence and truth. Ethan's words weren't merely a testimony, they were the beginning of a chain reaction he couldn't yet predict, from internal fallout to deeper exposure of those who had grown used to standing outside the bounds of justice. And it was in the silence between his subsequent answers that Ethan began to sense the true cost of choosing to stand on the side of truth. On a gloomy morning, in a secondary office at St. Elora Hospital, Angela Freeman sat upright with a nearly 100-page file before her. Attorney Meredith Cole stood behind her, silently observing each firm stroke of Angela's signature. The final line on the cover page clearly stated, "Formal complaint and request for criminal investigation submitted to the Federal Oversight Committee and the Department of Justice Region 6. This action was no longer a discrete initiative like the preliminary investigative memo submitted earlier. It was a public, official, and irreversible strike. On that very day, the Federal Communications Office confirmed receipt of the complaint from Judge Freeman, along with all accompanying transcripts, videos, photographs, and initial statements. Angela did not appear before the media. She offered no new statements or images, but both the political and judicial spheres understood clearly that her silence was the most forceful pressure of all. Attorney Meredith immediately activated her network, forwarding the case file to independent watchdog organizations, sending copies to the Regional Judges Association, and notifying a group of legislators closely following the incident. No one doubted the gravity of the situation anymore, for it was the first time in nearly 30 years that a sitting federal judge had personally filed charges against misconduct during a civil protest. In her complaint, Angela did not focus on her injuries. Her emphasis was on how the system treated protesters, how officers were shielded when overstepping authority, and especially how a certain video clip had disappeared from the internal case files. The final line of the document, underlined in red, read, "If justice can be edited with technology, then every verdict we have ever declared is now under threat." In Washington, D.C., several federal offices requested copies of the file. On evening news programs, constitutional law experts began analyzing applicable statutes, civil rights violations under Section 242, criminal evidence tampering, and obstruction of federal investigation. The event no longer revolved around a single fall, but had become a test of the entire system's integrity. 3 days after the complaint was filed, an independent investigative task force appeared at the police department with a warrant to access all data from devices connected to the incident. Leading the team was federal agent Hannah Ortiz, known for her investigations into police violence cover-ups in Baltimore. Her expression was cold as she walked through the main lobby, wearing a badge that read DOJ Special Task Force, and handed the deployment order directly to Lieutenant Mason. Mason froze as he received the order, then turned to see Walker standing at the end of the corridor, his hand gripping his belt. Ortiz wasted no time assigning the tech team to the server room and requesting a full log of access within the past 10 days. On the monitor, one access entry was highlighted "Training Classified," matching the exact timestamp of the incident. Walker was called separately into room 4. He sat across from Agent Ortiz, visibly unsettled, his back twitching. Ortiz placed a printed log on the table without a word, pointing directly to the user code W14K, Walker's own identifier. "Would you like to explain why the original video is no longer on the server, but the edited version is now stored under the training folder?" Ortiz asked. Her tone remained even, but each word struck like a nail. Walker stammered, citing unclear internal procedures, and then claimed it might have been an error during system migration. What he didn't know was that technician Marcus Dinn had already submitted a ghost image of the backup data to the Department of Justice via a private secure channel. The deleted footage had been fully restored, complete with timestamp and a code identifying the deletion as manual. As Walker continued his evasive responses, Ortiz pulled a USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table. "Are you aware the equipment room camera was operational that day as well?" Walker froze. There was nothing left to deny. He lowered his head, chest heaving, hands gripping the chair. Ortiz said nothing more, simply signaling to the recording agent to begin documentation. A formal criminal investigation was now underway, this time concerning federal data deletion and obstruction of justice. Simultaneously, in the Human Resources Office, Lieutenant Mason received a notice of immediate suspension. The investigative team demanded access to the entire command system of the mounted unit and froze all emails related to internal reports from the past 3 months. Walker was escorted out through the back entrance, not in handcuffs, but every eye in the department followed him. He knew then that every justification was meaningless. What he once believed to be protecting his team had now become indirect evidence indicting the entire unit. That night, Marcus Dinn remained in the server room. He replayed the backup footage once more, with the sound muted, watching only the look in Angela's eyes as she stared upward after being shoved to the ground. There was no scream, no cry for help, yet it was the very thing that had kept him awake for a week. Elsewhere in a darkened room with drawn curtains, Angela held the investigator report, Walker's name printed boldly in the top left corner. She folded the paper, poured herself a glass of cold water, and called Attorney Meredith. "It's time for me to appear." A press room was swiftly set up inside the city police headquarters. A banner behind the speaker's table read in bold letters, "Commitment to Transparency, Protecting Justice." Local TV stations, national news channels, and a slew of online platforms were all present. Studio lights beamed directly onto the face of a salt-and-pepper-haired man in a gray suit, preparing to speak. Maurice Leland, the attorney representing the police, sat down after adjusting the microphone clipped to his collar. His voice was deep and composed, each sentence underscored by a firm expression. He declared that the false information damaging the honor of the entire force cannot be ignored. According to him, at the time of the incident, the identity of the woman who fell had not yet been clearly verified. He opened a file in front of him, looked up, and read verbatim from the internal report. Angela Freeman had crossed beyond the designated safe boundary for protesters, entered an area reserved for mounted officers, and made a threatening gesture by raising her hand toward an officer. The horse's reaction was an instinctive response to perceived threat based on its training, he concluded, eyes locked on the lens. A short video was then played, allegedly from a surveillance camera mounted on a lamppost. The footage was blurry, shot from an angle, and lasted less than 8 seconds. In it, Angela raises her hand, her mouth open as if shouting something. However, the audio was missing, and the clip was tightly edited, removing all context before and after the moment captured. Social media immediately fractured into polarized views. Some accounts displaying police badges as avatars shared the clip with captions like, "Clear evidence no one was attacked without cause." In the comments section, debates erupted. Some questioned the accuracy, others asked why the beginning had been cut. Meanwhile, independent journalists began scrutinizing the footage. One, who had previously covered manipulated videos during past enforcement incidents, published the first analysis, arguing that the camera angle could not be the only source, and Angela's movement appeared entirely reflexive. Still, lacking the full footage, all arguments remained defensive. So the Angela's legal team responded cautiously. The lead attorney issued a brief statement, calling this a coordinated effort to distract public attention from the core issue, the unprovoked violence by law enforcement against an unarmed citizen. Angela herself remained silent. She did not appear, did not release any statements. That silence began to disorient the media, leaving them unsure where to aim their questions, unable to determine which side held the upper hand. Outside, civil society groups started showing signs of wavering. The protests cooled, partly influenced by media shifts, partly due to the absence of clear direction from Angela. As night fell over the city, major news broadcasts began shifting their tone. What began as questioning gradually turned into speculative framing that the officer's actions may have been situational overreaction. Viewers were led to believe the scales were tipping in favor of the mounted unit. But in a small forum where on-the-ground clips were being collected, an anonymous user named FreeEye91 posted a brief status. "There's footage from the second floor of a cafe, straight to her face. She stood still." Attached below was a video file no one had seen before. The video was just under 20 seconds long, yet the moment it was uploaded, it generated a shockwave stronger than any article released over the past week. The uploader was an unknown personal account, captioned simply, "Filmed from the cafe's second floor, I was there." The footage showed a wide-angle point pointing straight at the square's center where the incident occurred. There was no shakiness common to handheld footage. The camera was fixed inside the cafe, its lens cutting through thick glass that reflected part of the indoor lighting. At the center of the screen stood Angela Freeman, at the edge of the white line, holding her purse with both hands, eyes locked on the approaching mounted unit. There were no chants, no provocative gestures. Her face was tense, but not resistant. The mounted officer moved closer, step by step. In the moment the horse reared up, Angela stepped back half a pace, her right hand instinctively raised to shield her face. 1 second later, she fell. The entire video played out clearly, continuously, and unedited. It shattered every justification offered during the press briefing, laying bare the gap between truth and what the system tried to conceal. Within 30 minutes, the video began spreading rapidly, appearing simultaneously on 3 major platforms. Accounts that had previously shared the edited police clip fell silent, giving way to a new wave. She stood still. Justice for Angela. News coverage pivoted instantly. Anchors who previously hedged their words now used terms like deceptive and manipulative when referring to law enforcement's narrative. Political commentary shows launched live debates where veteran lawyers broke down the footage frame by frame, confirming that Angela's actions in no way constituted a threat to any officer. Former prosecutor Charles Harlow appeared on national television with a definitive statement. If this footage was intentionally withheld, we're not talking about individual misconduct. We're facing a system shielding violence under the guise of authority. Former Officer Dalton Moss, once a police academy instructor, added bluntly, "This has happened before. I've seen it. But this time, they picked the wrong person." That same night, an independent oversight body demanded that the police release all body camera footage from officers present at the scene. An internal report, previously kept sealed, became the center of public scrutiny. Multiple local lawmakers called for a federal investigation, questioning the role of command-level officers in orchestrating the original media campaign. Inside the mounted unit's operations room, the glow from the monitor lit up Tom Briggs's face. He slumped into a chair, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the looping clip. Angela, standing upright, raising her hand, then falling, replayed again. No words were spoken. He breathed heavily, then swallowed hard, as if suppressing something rising in his throat. A young officer passing behind him stopped, seeing Tom's frozen face. The officer looked at the screen, then lowered his head and muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe this time you won't get away with it." No one responded. Only the clatter of hooves echoed from the video, as if still pounding against the chests of those living under the illusion that truth would retreat before a well-orchestrated lie. Tobias Green still vividly remembered the afternoon he was summoned to the office to check the internal recording system of the mounted patrol unit. No direct order was given, but the tone made it clear they weren't asking for a technical analysis. They wanted a tidy conclusion. Tobias lowered his head and complied, his hand dragging the mouse through folders of video data, his eyes unconsciously registering time codes, device IDs, and the voices coming from the computer speakers. In his mind, the video didn't replay like evidence. It repeated like a choice. Each time he opened the file, every frame pushed him closer to confronting what he had once believed was the system protecting society. When the witness clip from the coffee shop surfaced and went viral, Tobias understood the moment had come. He stayed up all night. By morning, Tobias sent 2 emails. One went to the Special Oversight Committee, which was monitoring the case and had access to federal data. The other, encrypted, was sent to the office of Angela Freeman's legal representative. Attached was an unedited copy of the video taken from the body cam of the officer riding directly behind Tom Briggs. The footage was clear. Angela standing still near the curb, body motionless, eyes forward. Tom approached on horseback, stopping near the edge of the pavement. A tense silence before he leaned forward, squinted, and muttered something. The audio was intact. A gruff voice spat, "Just standing there staring, ha, int." Right after that, Tom's legs kicked sharply into the horse's flanks. The animal reared, tossed its head, triggering a chain reaction in the crowd. Angela stumbled. Her bag flew out. She fell. Screams followed. Everything unfolded in an unbroken sequence. The video ended with a man from the crowd stepping in to block a second horse preparing to charge. Just hours after receiving it, the Oversight Committee published the footage on its independent platform. The caption read, "Previously undisclosed material sourced from internal systems." The clarity, angle, and audio were more than enough to wipe away the cloud of doubt that had surrounded Angela for the past week. The media were forced to adjust. Channels that had previously supported the police legal team began issuing corrections and vague apologies, trying to save face. Legal analysts, investigative journalists, and even previously silent voices started reposting the video with captions directly attacking the system that had manipulated the data. The federal committee responded swiftly. A subpoena for Tom Briggs was issued the same day. A list of individuals involved in the improper handling of storage procedures was published, including the records supervisor, 2 surveillance officers, and a deputy commander of the mounted unit. Within the force, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Officers who had once defended Tom began to avoid him. No calls, no questions. The end-of-day team meeting was marked by heavy silence, eyes avoiding contact, and curt statements about personal responsibility. At higher levels, a deputy chief filed for temporary leave. A clerical staff member requested a department transfer. Internal calls surged, but now the focus wasn't on right or wrong. It was on how many would be dragged into the storm unleashed by a video that was never supposed to be seen. The room was deep within the administrative sector on the 6th floor, far from the main entrances. Soundproofed walls, thick curtains over glass panels, a desk meticulously arranged to the point of sterility. No secretary, no recording devices turned on. The meeting was scheduled off the books, invisible on any calendar. Angela had been called in for what felt like a silent ritual, amid a crisis spiraling out of control. Seated across from her was Judge Raymond Ellison, a familiar face in the federal judiciary, known for his discretion and skill in managing internal political turmoil. He looked far older than at their last meeting, his silver hair trimmed short, the skin on his wrist dry and veined beneath a cuffed shirt sleeve. "You know why I've called you," he began, his voice hoarse but firm. Angela sat straight, silent. He pulled a slim folder from the drawer and slid it across the table, unopened. "I've seen the new video," he said. "The one Tobias sent to the committee. It's very clear, undeniably." Angela didn't flinch, her gaze fixed on him. Raymond paused briefly, then continued, his tone softer. "I thought something like this wouldn't happen again, but this mounted unit, it was in an internal report back in 2009. A case buried deep, because it touched both state and federal jurisdictions. And you know what?" He curled his lip slightly. "The way they buried it was just as smooth as what they're trying to do with your case. You're poking at the filthiest part of the system," he added, now with no pretense. "And the system, if you don't already know, has a very strong self-preservation instinct. It doesn't respond with words. It makes inconvenient people disappear from places of influence." Angela didn't move, but her hands slowly clenched on her thighs. Ellison watched her, gauging every reaction. "I'm not here to tell you to back down. I once thought I'd be the one to change the system too. But the system, it doesn't change, it absorbs. If you keep going, what you lose won't just be your judgeship. It'll be your career, your safety, everything you believed was solid." He leaned back, his voice shifting into something almost advisory. "There are ways to end this without further damage. You could accept a settlement, an honorable compensation, a revised report that blames administrative error. No cover-up, a clean exit where everyone saves face." Angela didn't respond right away. She looked down at the envelope on the table, then slowly raised her head. Her eyes didn't hold defiance. They held a decision long made, forged in small courtrooms of poor neighborhoods, where she once heard the testimony of a black mother beaten for parking in the wrong spot, and during detention hearings she'd handled as a public defender. A flicker of memory brushed her like cold wind. The day she was appointed, she stood at the podium, eyes on the flag, bathed in muted white light. She had sworn to uphold justice, and she had believed that oath meant something. Angela tilted her head slightly. "I didn't come here to retreat." Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang with the clarity of metal striking stone. Ellison held her gaze a moment longer, saying nothing. His hand rested on the envelope, thumb tapping lightly on the edge. Angela stood up. She walked to the door without looking back. The hallway stretched long, carpeted in worn fabric, flickering under fluorescent lights. The air tinged with old paper and uncertainty. Her hand gripped the doorknob, as if to affirm one final time that from this moment on, there was no turning back. The hearing room was located on the ground floor of the Federal Administrative Building, a large space softened by amber-colored ceiling lights. The gallery was divided into two symmetrical rows, with a witness stand positioned in the far right corner of the counsel table. In the heavy silence of the room, all eyes turned toward a woman who had just entered. Angela wore a crisp white suit. Her shirt was perfectly pressed, and her cream-colored low heels moved in measured steps as if choreographed. There was no badge pinned to her chest, no visible armband. Her hair was neatly tied up, her neck upright, and her gaze met everyone's equally. She sat in the front row, hands resting on the edge of the table, a soft overhead light catching the bridge of her nose, casting a firm yet gentle line down her composed face. The seat next to her remained empty for a moment before a man in a gray-blue suit approached, whispered something in her ear, then stepped back and took a place among the legal advisory staff. Across the aisle, the city police's legal team entered together with the practiced coordination typical of administrative hearings. Among them was a familiar face from press conferences, Maurice Leland. He walked in gripping a folder tightly, his steps short but purposeful. Next to him, Tom Briggs sat in silence, his uniform replaced by a civilian button-up shirt with the second button undone, eyes red as if from sleepless nights. He did not glance around or look at Angela. His hands rested on his knees, his body tense, as though trying not to collapse into the chair. A gavel strike signaled the beginning of the hearing. A presiding judge, seated at the center of a three-member panel, tilted his head toward the police side. There was no lengthy introduction. Attorney Leland stood and spoke with a clear, calm voice. Honorable panel, my client, Officer Briggs, was performing his assigned duties by City Police Department regulations when confronted with a volatile situation at a protest site. He raised the folder but did not read from it. We have records indicating that the female subject left the designated area for peaceful protesters, approached mounted police, and engaged in threatening behavior through both language and aggressive gestures. The sound of paper turning was as soft as rain, but each of Leland's words landed like steel against marble. A grainy, distorted video from a blind spot camera played on the rear screen, showing a figure emerging from the crowd, arm extended. While full audio is unavailable, the hand motion could be misconstrued as threatening, Leland added, his tone lowering slightly, and in a moment of high tension, our officer reacted instinctively in self-defense. Angela remained motionless, unblinking. She rotated her wrist slightly, brushing the side of a small folder in front of her. The gesture was subtle, but the panel noticed. One of the three members asked, "Do you have a response to the allegations?" Angela nodded once. She did not look toward the prosecution or the panel. She opened the folder, pulled out a small silver hard drive, placed it on the table, and gently pushed it toward the hearing clerk. "I request the panel to review footage captured from the body cam of Officer F. Martinez, mounted unit positioned behind Officer Briggs at the time of the incident." Her voice was steady, not loud, but each word rang with clarity. The panel agreed. The device was plugged into the projector. The screen shifted. A high-resolution video began playing with clear audio. The footage opened with mounted officers tightening formation near the crowd. Tom Briggs was on horseback, eyes locked on Angela. There was no pushing. Angela stood near a tree, clutching her bag, completely still. From the rear angle, it was clear that Tom looked at her and muttered something. The microphone recorded the words, "Bold enough to stare me down." Then came a sharp nudge from his boot, and the horse lunged forward. Angela stepped back, instinctively raising her hands before falling. The crowd's gasp echoed almost simultaneously. In the room, no one moved. Each replayed frame cut deeper into the fragile line between truth and justification. Leland clenched the handle of his briefcase. One panel member leaned toward another, whispered something, and requested a replay, starting from minute 6. With each replay, the defense's argument visibly shrank. Tom lowered his head, his back hunched forward, the proud posture once held in court now burdened like a sack of wet sand. Sweat formed beneath his collar. His hand slipped from his pocket, but remained idle. Lips pressed shut, he offered no resistance, no rebuttal. Angela said nothing more. She sat still after the video ended, eyes on the screen that remained bright, her expression unchanged. No declaration, no triumph, only the presence of someone who had laid the truth bare in the center of the room, placing it like a stone in a river bed, forcing everyone to either walk around or face it directly. The panel acknowledged the evidence and signaled the end of the presentation. The hearing recessed for 10 minutes of private deliberation. People slowly rose from their seats. The sound of shoes tapping on stone, papers brushing table edges, and steadying breaths filled the room, the restrained aftermath of confronting what had long been denied. Angela stood. She did not glance at Tom. She exited the front row and walked along the aisle. White light shimmered across her back with every step, stretching behind her like the shadow of an oath never broken. The Internal Affairs Office was located on the 3rd floor, in the Auxiliary Administrative Wing. It was not large, but cold enough to evoke a stifling sensation. The door was fitted with one-way reflective glass. The desk was an old, dark wooden piece, and a single screen was angled on a swivel mount in the center of the room. Tom sat facing it, hands interlocked, head bowed low. He wasn't in uniform, but wore a light gray t-shirt, the collar wrinkled, the left shoulder bearing a crease from being folded for hours in the same position. The screen remained on. The footage replayed again. The angle was familiar. Every detail projected clearly. His eyes, the moment his hand yanked the reins, the heel digging forcefully into the horse's side. The audio captured the sentence spoken just before that motion, each word displayed as though echoed from his own throat. The first time he watched it, he clenched his teeth, silent as someone wrongly accused. The second time, his eyelids flickered. The third time, his right hand relaxed and instinctively ran down his thigh. Those seconds didn't register in his mind as a rationale, but overwhelmed him with what he had once believed to be a justified reflex. Tom had never thought his actions were wrong until that image appeared from a different angle, from a distance that left no room for denial. In his mind had always played a preset soundtrack: reaction, threat, necessity, justification. But here, every excuse was stripped away when facing himself in an unfiltered moment of truth. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there. As the light outside the hallway dimmed, there were 2 knocks at the door, and then it opened gently. The person who entered carried a familiar scent, lavender and fresh ink. Maeve Holland stood at the threshold, holding a shoulder bag, her eyes meeting his without expression. Maeve had once been the woman he loved, once lived with him for 4 years, before transferring to the Internal Communications Division at the Department of Justice. Their breakup hadn't been over arguments, but because she no longer believed in the path he had chosen. Today, the silence between them lasted only a few breaths. "I've been assigned to revise the internal communication file on this case," she said without preamble. "They think you might want to offer a personal response, or at least an explanation." Tom looked up, his gaze steady but slow. "I don't know what I have left to say." "Are you planning to stay silent until you lose everything?" Maeve sat down across from him, pulled out a voice recorder, and placed it on the table. "Or are you waiting for someone to feel sorry for you?" He gave a faint, bitter laugh and shook his head. "I know I was wrong, but I realized it too late, and it doesn't change what's already happened." She remained quiet for a long while, then turned on the device, though she didn't hit record. "It might not change the past, but at the very least, You need to take responsibility for the present." Tom tilted his head toward her, his eyes still carrying a pain too complex to name. "What would you do if what I said put your whole communications unit in a difficult position? You're the only one over there willing to look this case in the eye." Maeve didn't answer right away. She pressed her finger on the power button and turned the recorder off completely. "I haven't decided," she said in a softer tone. "If I help you, I might lose my position. But if I keep that position by silencing myself, what's it even worth?" Tom lowered his head, his eyes heavy for the first time, shoulders sinking deep into the chair as if collapsing after a long internal war. His voice was slow, as if confessing more to himself than to her. "I used to believe I was doing the right thing. Keeping order was the priority. Reacting before trouble arose was the only way to survive in this job. But when I saw her eyes, I knew I had crossed a line I once swore never to touch." Maeve closed her eyes for a few seconds. Her face no longer held its old firmness. She picked up her bag, stood, walked to the desk, and left a thin envelope. "This is the internal media briefing summary for the case. It includes a section I wrote. I haven't signed it. I'll wait 2 more days." Tom looked up, his eyes landing on the envelope, then shifting to her gaze. "If I apologize publicly, will you hold off on submitting that version?" She didn't smile, nor give a direct answer. "If your apology's genuine, there won't be a need to hold anything back. People will know what to believe." She turned and left. The sound of her heels wasn't loud, but it was enough to bring the silence back to the room. Tom remained still, reaching for the envelope, opening it and reading the first line of the document. "Internal Communication Strategy Brief, Case Hearing Developments." The final line, handwritten, "Sometimes the truth doesn't make you lose everything. It brings you back to who you are." He leaned back, eyes toward the ceiling, the dim white light casting shadows across a face now altered. A new uncertainty began to take shape inside him, not from exposure, but because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what was worth protecting anymore. The late afternoon wind slipped through a cracked window, causing the old curtain to stir like shallow breath. Everything Tom had once clung to was slipping from his grasp, not because someone had taken it away, but because he was the one forced to open his hands, to touch it, and to choose whether to move past or turn back. And in that in-between space, no one else could decide for him. The hearing that day ended in an atmosphere of uncertainty. The prosecution continued to attempt technical justifications for Tom's actions, but the growing weight of public opinion and direct evidence weakened every argument. Angela stepped out of the conference room under the pale yellow light spilling from the courthouse hallway. A clerk quietly handed her a note. "Someone wishes to register as an additional witness." He used to be a police officer, once served in the same unit as the defendant. Angela took the note and glanced quickly at the name in the upper left corner. She frowned slightly but said nothing. The paper was neatly folded and slipped into her coat pocket, as if she were already accustomed to unexpected interruptions in this ongoing battle. The next morning, the man appeared. He sat in the middle of the small meeting room of the Federal Investigative Committee. Trim build, short hair, deep-set eyes, a faint scar on his left jaw. He introduced himself as Malcolm Price. He had served 5 years in the city's mounted unit before withdrawing due to inability to maintain tactical coordination. Angela entered after reviewing his file. She paused at the doorway, her eyes frozen for a brief second. Malcolm looked up and nodded. In the silent room, neither of them needed to ask, "Have we met before?" because memory had already answered with the very first glance. He sat upright, speaking slowly and steadily. "I want to testify about an incident that happened 3 years ago at Station 7. Tom Briggs was then an internal trainer. I was assaulted on the training grounds. There was no professional reason." The room fell silent. One investigator asked, "Was anyone there to witness it?" Malcolm nodded. 3 people. 2 of them have since left the force. 1 is still in the unit." He paused briefly, then added, "And that person was threatened with reassignment if they spoke up." Angela asked nothing. She simply listened. For months, she had learned the value of silence. Sometimes, silence prompts people to reveal the most," Malcolm continued, his face unmoved. "I was asked to leave the unit 6 months later. On paper, it was because I failed to meet tactical cooperation standards. But in truth, everyone knew why. I didn't file a complaint, I didn't react. At the time, I even believed maybe I really didn't belong there." Another committee member asked, "Why speak out now?" Malcolm looked directly at Angela. "Because for the first time I saw someone who didn't back down. Not because she was attacked, but because she was misjudged. I think if I stay silent, then I become part of the silence that justifies everything." After the internal session, Angela stepped out and requested to meet Malcolm privately. They moved to a small room with no recording devices. She sat across from him and poured 2 glasses of water. "Do you remember which school I went to?" she asked, half joking. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, then smiled faintly. "Harvard Law, though we weren't in the same class." Angela nodded, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Same year, though." He nodded again and tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "I remember a senior year paper, your name was first on the list. It was about the right to expression in civil settings when armed forces are present. Back then, I didn't read it for the legal arguments. I read it wondering why a black student would dare write about something no one else dared to touch in that school." Angela looked down at her glass. "I wrote it because I used to be afraid. Now I file lawsuits because I used to be stepped on." Malcolm sat straighter. "I'm not here for vindication. I don't need thanks. I just think it's time I stood for what's right." Sunlight sliced through the small window behind them, casting a diagonal beam across the table. Angela pulled a folder from her coat pocket and handed it over. "Sign here. Your testimony will be sent directly to the Internal Commission. After the trial, you may be asked to appear publicly." Malcolm took the pen. "I know. If needed, I will stand." His words were not loud, but they were firm, placed exactly where and when they needed to be. Angela rose first, nodding in place of gratitude. As her hand reached the door handle, Malcolm spoke softly behind her. "They don't know we went to the same school. I didn't plan to bring it up, because to me, that's not as important as the fact that we're on the same side now." She turned back briefly, a faint smile on her lips. "I think so too." The door closed behind her as if sealing off a chapter that had never been fully opened. Both had left that school on very different paths. One ascended to the federal court, the other was forced out of service with an unnamed scar. But today, they met again, exactly where justice needed those who had once been wounded to know how to protect the truth. And in this world, nothing is more unexpected than 2 seemingly unrelated people becoming the critical link to unravel a system thought to be sealed. On Monday morning, the internal bulletin from the police department was issued earlier than usual. The headline appeared routine, carrying only a concise phrase: "Personal notice regarding federal committee investigation." However, on the second page, within a short paragraph, the name Tom Briggs was officially mentioned, along with the phrase "temporarily suspended from duty pending the conclusion of the independent agency's findings." The news spread faster than any live stream. Along the 3rd-floor corridor, groups of officers clustered together in hushed tension, their murmurs sharper than the sound of coffee pouring. Inside the shared office, chairs scraped more harshly. Papers were slammed impatiently onto desks. The lieutenant in charge of the mounted unit, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Tom through dozens of protest dispersals, folded the notice aggressively and threw it in the trash. A young officer started to retrieve it, but recoiled at the cold stare he received. At the far end of the room, another group remained silent. These were officers who had witnessed many things but never spoken up. Among them was Hannah, the only female officer in the unit, who had once been on duty with Tom during a high-profile incident 2 years prior, a case that never made it into the official reports. She leaned against the filing cabinet, staring at the sunlight on the floor, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The department atmosphere split sharply into 2 factions. One furious, believing their man was wrongly punished, the other silent, knowing this reckoning was long overdue. Chief Russell understood this when he signed the suspension order for Tom. It was not a decision made lightly, But with evidence mounting from the federal investigation team, he had no other choice. He stood in his office, gazing through the frosted glass at the hallway where footsteps thudded heavier than usual. He knew the division was not about right or wrong, but about a wall of silence cracking, a wall everyone had seen, but no one dared to name aloud. He also knew that if he hesitated today, tomorrow there would be nothing left to salvage. That same afternoon, something no one anticipated occurred. Walker, the officer previously in charge of surveillance and technical oversight, went missing without explanation. The Internal Affairs Unit could not reach him. His phone was off and no one responded at his listed address. 2 colleagues went to the small apartment he rented near the outskirts and found the door unlocked. Everything inside was untouched, except for one external hard drive placed in the center of the table, next to a sealed envelope. The officer who found it was Perez, a logistics officer, who then handed both the drive and the envelope to the data review team. The lead technician confirmed the drive was unencrypted and showed no signs of tampering. The first thing that appeared on the screen was a single folder labeled simply Briggs RP7. Inside were a series of body camera clips from mounted unit officers, including footage never previously disclosed. Some clips had been removed from the central system before reaching the shared database. There were internal radio recordings capturing the lead lieutenant, giving the command, "Clear them out fast, push first, ask later." One Excel file listed timestamps of report edits following every mounted unit deployment. Tom's name appeared more than 12 times, tied to protests across 3 different locations. In the final note by Walker, a shaky handwritten line read, "I can't pretend anymore. If this ever reaches the public, at least they'll know I didn't stay complicit to the end." While investigators were reviewing the content, a new report arrived from the Legal Affairs Division. Based on the drive's data, they called for a broader investigation into the full operations of the mounted unit across the past 2 terms and immediately froze all accounts and communications of 3 supervisory officers. Chief Russell received the news in his office, head slightly bowed, rubbing his forehead. He phoned home, saying he'd be late. After hanging up, he pulled an old photo from his drawer, their first-year team portrait, himself beside Tom and the lieutenant. All 3 looked younger, more confident. Eyes were still clear. That clarity was gone now, replaced by suspicion, rivalry, and disappointment. He knew that ever since Angela Freeman's emergence, truths, long buried, had begun to seep through the cracks, and what Walker left behind felt like a final parachute, one for his conscience. That evening, the media ran a brief headline. Police Department confirms suspension of Officer Tom Briggs pending investigation. But beneath that short line, underground currents were surging, stronger than any wave of protest. Outside headquarters, small groups gathered, quietly laying flowers at the base of a statue honoring fallen officers. One man took out his phone and played the video clip of Angela being attacked. When the light from the screen reflected off the badge that had fallen beside her, he reached out, touched the glass gently, then let his hand fall, exhaling deeply. In that city, long accustomed to ambiguous decisions and spotless reports, there was something that could no longer be hidden. The truth, once leaked, would not retreat, and from that day on, those within the gray brick building understood that this time there was no more room left to back away. On Saturday night, the press conference, held on the front lawn of City Hall, attracted nearly all major and minor media outlets in the region. Under makeshift lighting, cameras simultaneously adjusted their focus, lenses aimed at the wooden podium set in the center, where a large banner read, "Official update from Judge Angela Freeman's legal representative." Angela did not appear. Standing in her place was her official attorney, Jonathan Kessler, a man in his early 40s known for his dry voice and cold logic. He brought no thick folders, no assistants. At the podium, he held only a black USB drive, which he plugged into the prepared projector. He began in a calm tone, but his gaze pierced directly into the rows of reporters. "I'm not here to express feelings. I'm here to present evidence. What you are about to see includes material that was once deleted from the system, material that was concealed internally, and material that the public has the right to know. The wall behind him turned into a large projection screen. The first video showed Tom Briggs on horseback, advancing into the protest zone. The footage, captured from the body camera of an officer behind him, was sharp and time-stamped clearly. Every hoofbeat, every chant from the crowd was recorded in full detail. Next came an internal radio recording. A man's voice rang out clearly. "Advance, clear if necessary, signal already given on the other side." A quieter reply followed. "Civilians are not resisting," unit leader confirmed. The exchange ended with 2 seconds of silence, then a deep breath, like someone choosing to ignore what they heard. Jonathan nodded lightly to the technician. The next slide appeared, a comparative table of surveillance system data from that day. Timestamps had been altered, footage was cut, and login records showed Walker accessing the system 24 hours before his disappearance. The evidence stacked one after another, needing no narration, heavy enough to weigh on anyone watching. A female reporter stood and asked loudly, "Why isn't Judge Freeman speaking directly?" Jonathan looked at her, unflinching, because she knows that standing in front of the cameras now would overshadow the value of the evidence. This is the moment for the public to look directly at the system, not at a single person. His answer cast the courtyard into a brief silence, followed by a flurry of note-taking. Live broadcasts captured the scene, slowly replaying the image of the fallen badge under that day's sunlight. The engraved words shimmered: United States Federal Judiciary, 6th Circuit. Outside the fence of the building, the number of protesters grew larger than usual. They carried no large banners, shouted no slogans. They stood in small groups, wearing headphones, eyes glued to phone screens, watching the press conference. Across social media, millions of shares exploded at once. The hashtag Justice for Angela resurfaced, now accompanied by the symbol of a badge and raised hands in a non-resistant pose. The next morning, Tom Briggs was urgently summoned. In a closed investigation room, he faced not only investigators but also a representative from the Department of Justice. On the table lay neatly arranged copies of the video, documents, Malcolm Price's testimony, and hard drive data. Tom sat still, hands clasped tightly, eyes straight but unfocused. When asked about his actions at the scene, he answered slowly, "I acted on operational instinct. I didn't intend to attack." An investigator flipped through the file. "You previously stated that protesters threatened you. How do you explain the camera footage showing the victim standing still, hands held in front of her chest?" Tom remained silent. His eyes fell on the printed photo of Angela, collapsed, blood smeared on her cheek, her left hand scraping the pavement. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a near whisper. "I was wrong. I thought I had identified the threat correctly, but I misjudged." A lawyer sitting beside him turned a document, lightly placed a hand on his shoulder. Tom nodded, then turned to the Department of Justice representative. "I request an independent attorney, separate from unit representation. I'm ready to retell everything, including previous incidents where I was instructed to intervene under preset directives." His words caused the entire room to pause for several beats. The lead investigator tilted his head and asked clearly, "You confirm you were ordered to act beyond your authority?" Tom did not evade. "I confirm there were covert orders. No paperwork, but people heard, people knew, and I have no reason to hold anything back anymore." That same day, he signed a new statement. In it, beyond the incident at the square where Angela was attacked, he listed 7 other cases, including 2 student protests, 1 routine inspection in a black neighborhood, and 1 mistaken assault on an independent healthcare worker. That afternoon, Tom officially appeared before the press for the first time since his suspension. He exited through the side door of the police headquarters, not in uniform, not wearing his badge. Before the cameras, he read no statement. He spoke in a low, slightly trembling voice, but clearly. "I acted wrongly, both in my actions and in my perspective. I let the distortions of the system guide my judgment, and I apologize, not just to Judge Freeman, but to everyone who once believed we were there to protect them." His words were replayed continuously on evening broadcasts. Citizens shared the video. but this time not in outrage. They shared it as a reminder that even those who have done wrong can choose to turn back if they truly recognize what they've caused. On a small street corner where Angela's collapse photo had once been pasted on a light pole, a street artist replaced it with a new image, a woman rising from the ground, hands still dusty but her head held high. Behind her, a police officer removing his cap, eyes lowered. In a city long accustomed to silence and the collisions of power, this counterattack did not come from guns or slogans. It came from evidence, truth spoken aloud, and an apology made at the right moment. And sometimes that alone is enough to ensure the system will never be the same again. The news broadcast aired early in the morning, amidst headlines about exchange rates and local elections, yet it became the most shared story within the next 3 hours. The anchor's voice was clear, with emphasis on every phrase the city had been waiting for. The United States Department of Justice has officially issued a comprehensive investigation order against the city-mounted police unit concerning allegations of violence and procedural violations during the event. On the screen abruptly switched to a breaking banner that read, "Multiple officers suspended immediately." In an unmarked office on the 3rd floor of the administrative complex, a group of people in suits took turns signing suspension orders. A list of names was read aloud, and the eyes of those present tightened with each click of the printer. At a police station just 2 blocks away, officers from the mounted unit were summoned one by one. The internal organization no longer maintained a defensive stance, as the media, human rights organizations, and community members had unified their voices. The conversations were brief, many eyes lowered to the desk, and some attempted to respond, but were quickly cut off by a firm shake of the head from the internal affairs representative. One of the last to be called that morning was Lieutenant Blaylock, Tom's direct superior. He sat motionless in a worn leather chair for 5 full minutes after hearing the temporary suspension decision. Notes in his personnel file revealed that he had ignored at least 2 violations within the unit, including a complaint regarding the misuse of horses in densely populated areas. Any attempts at justification were now meaningless. The pre-suspension order was placed on the desk. No explanation was needed. A few local newspapers swiftly ran bold headlines. At last, they must face what once seemed untouchable. Political commentators described it as a pivotal shift, not only for the city but also for how the federal government oversees units that had long operated nearly beyond accountability. For Tom, the news arrived in a sealed envelope, delivered to the temporary apartment he was staying in, about 15 minutes from downtown. The mail carrier knocked twice and left, placing on the doorstep a printed document stamped in red. Inside was a 4-page decision outlining the reasons, procedures, and final conclusion. Tom would not face criminal charges due to insufficient evidence of intent, but his actions had exceeded the permissible scope of duty. One line was bolded, "Permanently barred from holding any public position involving law enforcement authority or direct civilian contact." Tom read it twice, from start to finish. Each word sank slowly into his veins, not causing immediate pain, but leaving his entire body heavy and worn. He placed the paper on the table and looked out the window, where a child was kicking a ball against a brick wall. The thuds echoed rhythmically, indifferent to the pages that had been printed or signed elsewhere. His phone remained silent all afternoon. The day before, his personal attorney had warned, "If you don't step down voluntarily, you'll just be removed anyway." Tom had replied with a single message, "I understand." That message now sat unread, with no response. In the late afternoon, during a short press briefing by the Department of Justice, a spokesperson stood before the microphone and stated, "We do not overlook any violations that may endanger public safety, regardless of the individual's identity, rank, or years of service." Everyone in the room took notes simultaneously, and several cameras zoomed in on the spokesperson's face. The quote was later clipped into a short video and circulated on social media with the caption, "When the law begins to look back at itself." In Angela's neighborhood, a neighbor knocked on her door holding a small bouquet and a handwritten note. "We know you never wanted this to happen, but thanks to you, It didn't stay buried. Angela opened the door, smiled faintly, and invited them inside. The atmosphere in the room was quietly composed, as if everyone understood this wasn't a victory, but a kind of recovery that needed to remain undisturbed. At a university cafe, students who had once participated in the protest gathered to rewatch the original clip on a large screen. When it reached the moment Angela fell, the entire room went silent. One student turned to another and whispered, "We didn't know she was a judge, but now it feels like she had to be there." Tom spent the rest of the day walking around the park near his apartment. He wore a baseball cap and avoided eye contact. The trees lining the path cast shadows over chipped wooden benches. Children played nearby, not recognizing him. A small dog ran past his feet, barking in short bursts. Tom reached down to pet it, but stopped halfway. His hand stretched out and withdrew as if it had never intended to move. When night fell, he returned to the apartment, turned on his computer, and logged into the internal police system one last time to submit his resignation, even though no one was waiting for it anymore. In the section marked Reason, he typed a single line: "Everything has gone beyond what's called protocol." No one edited that sentence. No one added a period. The late-night news repeated the Justice Department's statement, the same voice reading it as before. An image of Angela in a white suit standing in front of the courthouse holding a stack of files was appended below as a silent acknowledgement. In the corner of the screen, a ticker ran. "The city will review all regulations regarding the deployment of mounted units in residential areas and peaceful protests." No one said whether mounted police would still be necessary, but perhaps those heavy steps on the pavement would have to learn how to land more gently, or step away. The letter appeared on the front pages of 3 major newspapers simultaneously, just as the city had emerged from a night of rain that cleared the thin layer of dust covering the sidewalks. Readers quickly saw the signature at the end: Angela Freeman, federal judge of the 6th Circuit. But it was the opening line that left people speechless before they even noticed her title. "This is not my victory. This is a wound made visible." The words were printed in a standard font, without bolding or sensationalism, yet each syllable seemed to burst beyond its frame, seeping directly into the hushed feeling of a city still recovering from upheaval. Angela did not mention any names. She gave no dates, no description of a scene that everyone had already watched hundreds of times. She only wrote about what went through her mind as she lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing a distant ambulance siren, and knowing others out there were hurting too. She recalled being a black child growing up in neighborhoods never featured on tourist maps, where the question, "Where are you going?" could end in a blaring siren, where silence was taught as a self-defense skill. She said she didn't want the next generations to have to learn that again, not by repeating her journey, but by walking paths she had never been allowed to step on. Each paragraph of the letter did not seem to aim for conclusions or rallying calls. They read like fragments of a conversation with herself, yet that very quality gave the letter a strange weight. People passed around printed copies, clipped out images to share, reread every line as if checking their own place in a story they once believed was distant. Some remembered just one part. "When you become too familiar with being stepped on, you learn to call survival a stroke of luck. I don't want to survive anymore. I want dignity to be normalized." The letter ended in a softer tone than the rest. "I will return to the bench. Not because I am strong, but because no one should remain bowed while the wrongdoer stands tall." The federal courthouse reopened on Monday under a silver-gray sky. There were no crowds jostling, no flurry of cameras. A few reporters waited at the gate, but none pushed up against the doors as they had during the earlier weeks of chaos. Angela's appearance no longer felt like breaking news. It was something people had long awaited, yet no longer needed to witness in order to believe. She arrived 10 minutes before working hours, as she had for many years, her judge's robe draped over a pale gray dress, her hair neatly pinned at the nape. Her face wore no makeup but glowed in the reflection from the glass doors. She did not pause before flashing lights, nor bow or wave. She merely nodded as the security officer opened the door for her, their eyes meeting in a brief moment that made it clear this return was unlike any other. The first case on the docket was a civil complaint involving the alleged unlawful dismissal of a school security officer on the grounds of cultural misalignment. The plaintiff's lawyer specified in the filings that his client had been discriminated against due to race. The defendant denied the claim, citing professional performance issues. Angela sat on the elevated bench, hands clasped, observing both sides. Her face revealed nothing but focus, but everyone present felt her gaze cut more deeply than usual. Perhaps not because the case was complex, but because they knew this judge understood what it meant to be diminished simply for who one was. Her questions were not lengthy, but each one caused both attorneys to pause and consider before answering. At one point, she looked directly at the plaintiff, a middle-aged man in a faded shirt, and quietly asked, "Do you think your dignity needs justification?" The courtroom fell silent. The man bowed his head, clasped his hands tightly, and his eyes were moist, without a single tear falling. That hearing ended on time. No one asked for a delay, no voices were raised. People walked out feeling as though they had just attended a master class on the final boundaries of human dignity. In the hallway, a few law interns sat silently, watching her figure recede. One female student whispered to her friend, "She doesn't need to speak loudly. You can still clearly see the line between right and wrong." In the days that followed, Angela presided over more cases involving discrimination, unlawful termination, and veiled hatred in the workplace. The press no longer swarmed the courthouse, but each verdict she signed was cited, discussed, and archived by multiple legal organizations. The legal community began revisiting previous rulings, using new cases under her to reassess standards of fairness. A month later, a prestigious law school invited her to teach a short seminar on professional ethics. Angela declined, but sent a written piece titled, "Law is What We Must Invoke When People Forget How to Respect Each Other." One morning, Angela received a hand-delivered envelope from a private courier. Inside was a printed photo on translucent paper. She was sitting in court, surrounded by the same protesters who had now become legal aids. On the back of the photo was a handwritten line, "You once stood alone. Now we stand with you." Angela placed the photo in a drawer beside an old, worn book marked in pencil with the names of the wrongly accused she had judged over the years. Sometimes she took it out to read, then quietly put it back without a word. At the end of each workday, she often stepped onto the sixth-floor balcony overlooking the square where everything once happened. There was no resentment in her eyes nor satisfaction, just the quiet ritual of looking toward a place that had once hospitalized her, now turned into a symbol for a shift in justice. On the old wooden desk she had used since her days as a district judge, a new ruling was being drafted. The desk lamp shone onto the faint scar on her wrist, a mark fading over time but never gone. As she once wrote, "Wounds do not disappear, but at least now, people no longer pretend they never existed." And perhaps it is their very existence that gives meaning to her return. Not to reclaim reputation, but to carry on the work that those once forced to bow never got the chance to rise and complete. Angela Freeman, not a symbol, not a victim, but a judge, at work exactly where she belongs, as if she had never left. The fourth-floor apartment was not large. Its walls were painted a pale gray, and the old tiled floor had a faint crack near the window. Sunlight slanted through a thin curtain, casting a pale yellow hue across the room, light that was neither warm nor cold. In one corner sat a scratched, particle-board desk, dotted with stains of dried coffee. On the desk, the computer screen was on, paused at a frame where Angela stood sideways, eyes wide, staring at the charging horse. Tom sat motionless in his chair. His back was hunched in the way of someone who had grown used to giving orders, but was now forced to bow, even with no one around to witness it. He pressed replay again, this time at a slower speed. The sound from the clip faded, leaving only his own labored breathing echoing in the silent room. In the next frame, Angela fell, Her arm hit the ground and an object dropped, a flash of metal glinting before the camera shook slightly. Tom paused there, rewound a few seconds, then slowed it down even further. He had done this dozens of times since the video was made public, but each replay still caused something deep in his chest to contract. On the wall-mounted TV, the news ticker scrolled across the bottom. The anchor's voice was calm, unhurried, like someone reading an obituary. The federal Supreme Court has approved the proposal to ban the deployment of mounted police in civil protests. The order will take effect nationwide starting next month, requiring a full review of all protocols involving the use of animals in community control. Tom's eyes paused for a second on the word nationwide as it passed. He turned back to the computer screen, muted the volume, and hit play. His right hand trembled slightly on the mouse, as if the skin touching the keyboard no longer belonged to the man it once served. Across the kitchen, an untouched kettle sat waiting to be boiled. A pack of instant noodles lay near the sink's edge. These small details acted like silent evidence of isolation, slowly drowning a man who once saw himself as the center of coordinated order. Now, career, colleagues, and the reason to get up every morning had all quietly withdrawn from him, just as Angela had turned away after the final hearing, with the same clarity and finality. On the desk, an opened envelope revealed a letter from the Internal Disciplinary Agency, reminding him that his file remained under 5-year review. Though not prosecuted, he was barred from rejoining any government law enforcement entity. No suspended sentence, but also no path back. Outside the window, the faint sound of car horns drifted up from the street. He looked down and saw a group of students in matching class shirts walking together, laughing, their laughter lightly brushed against the edge of a memory from his youth, when becoming an officer seemed like a badge of honor, proof of a man's worth. He had never imagined he would fall, not because the horse stumbled, but because the very reason he had mounted it had long since rotted away. Elsewhere, Angela walked briskly down a street leading to the central square. The sky was clear, the wind gentle. The road had just been washed after a night of rain, making the pale tiles shine like new. A few children played on scooters. Street vendors opened umbrellas and arranged fruit stalls along the sidewalk. Life had returned with uncanny completeness, as if this place had never been the epicenter of a justice-driven fury, where a horse nearly touched human skin and a woman had risen from the ground not by force, but by the sharpness of silence. Angela stopped at the exact spot where the impact had occurred. There was no marker, no stone plaque, no wreath, but she remembered precisely where the tile dipped slightly, where her knee had hit, where her hand had brushed. The wind blew through her hair, as gently as a friend's hand on hers, shoulder offering comfort without words. A group of university students passed by. One recognized her but dared not approach. Angela looked at them and smiled. Not a polite smile, not a political one. For the first time since the incident, her face truly relaxed, not because anything had been redeemed, but because, for once, she no longer felt the need to brace herself for others to see her. She took out her phone, snapped a photo of the street, then turned it off. No need to post it, no need to caption. This scene didn't require an audience. It had already etched itself into too many memories and stood well enough on its own as living proof of a change once deemed impossible. Nearby, a young girl being walked to school by her mother turned back to look at Angela once more before entering the gate. The child's gaze brought Angela back to her own early days in law school, when she was once asked, why not choose a more practical career? She smiled again, this time nodding slightly to the child, as if passing on an old message. This road isn't easy, but it's worth walking. But across the street, a bus drove by, bearing a slogan for a new public campaign: Humane Law Enforcement. Protect through understanding, not force. The words flashed by in an instant, just long enough to evoke something opposite to everything Angela had witnessed that morning years ago. She turned and walked away from the square, blending into the crowd, heading to work. Her white shirt mingled with the sunlight. No one turned to look, no one called her name, and in that silence, for the first time, she felt she could walk freely, unobserved, unjudged, unmeasured by her rank, her race, or old scars. A woman passing by, carrying a bouquet of flowers, asked for directions to the city hall. Angela pointed and said a few words, then continued on. The brief exchange made it feel like she had never been anyone of note, like the place where she now stood bore no relation to the name once featured in hundreds of headlines. And so the city lived on. People kept moving, and justice was still being served, not through outrage, but through steady, silent, and clear-headed footsteps. Step by step, with no one being ridden anymore. Have you ever been misunderstood, judged unfairly, simply because someone didn't truly know who you are, or perhaps underestimated until you quietly proved your real worth? If this story made you pause and reflect, share it. Let others see the invisible biases that still shape the world around us. Every share is a step closer to empathy and justice. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories where truth, courage, and belief in justice are always given a voice.